Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in land law. In our continuation on the issue of co-ownership, I want to talk in this lesson about the methods of severance. So we discussed severance in the previous lesson, and we discussed what it was, what it entails, how it works. This lesson is going to outline, at least, we'll recap what we mean when we talk about severance, and we will then also outline the process of identifying the different methods by which severance takes place. And so this really comes from the case of Williams and Hensman, something that we'll talk about in this lesson as well. But like I mentioned, the previous lesson spoke about the concept of severance in relation to the idea of co-ownership. We talked about what severance was and how it works. And in this lesson and over the next few lessons, we're going to spend some time talking about how severance happens, the different methods by which severance takes place. So as a basic recap then, what is severance and how does it work? What is the process by which severance takes place? If we see three people, okay, who are all joint tenants of a property, A, B, and C, and they also hold the property on trust for themselves as joint beneficiaries of the tenancy. We see that what we have is rights in law, which exists in the form of the joint tenancy, in A, B, and C. We also have rights in equity in the form of a joint tenancy, given the fact that a joint tenancy can be either in law and in equity. So this is what we get so far in terms of the process of a joint tenant, the process of co-ownership of property, shall we say. And then we go through the process of severance. Let's say that the third person, that C, decides that they want to sever. They want to sever their interests and to become a tenancy in common. What happens here is that at law, nothing happens. Severance does not affect legal title. A, B, and C remain joint tenants in law. But in equity, we see a division. We see a division between A and B on the one hand, who have not severed, and C, who has. And what we see here is that A and B remain joint tenants in equity, but that C turns into and becomes a tenancy in common in equity. And so this is really what the process of severance involves. Now, the methods of severance are quite numerous. There are a number of ways in which severance can take place, all of which are outlined in the case of Williams and Hensman from 1861. This was a case that concerned some money which had been bequeathed to be invested in stocks. 8 children were involved in this, in the money that was bequeathed at the point at which somebody had died. All had consented to the money being invested into a mortgage fund. A number of things would then occur in terms of, in relation to the children's relationship to the money specifically, some of them being too young to end the trust, for example. And the question for the court essentially was whether the beneficiaries of the trust were still being co-owned under a joint tenancy or whether severance had taken place at any point during this particular process. And the court outlined, and in essentially trying to answer this question, to ascertain an answer to this question, they had to think about, well, how does severance take place? And they outlined the different methods and modes of severance, all of which exist to this day. The methods of severance are as follows. We have written notice, which is often considered to be the most simple and easy to understand method of severance. You have the act of operating on one's own share. So essentially, in layman's terms, what this means is where you are a joint tenant, you are acting as a single cohesive unit, as what we've been talking about previously in our lessons on co-ownership. And so by acting on your own share, you act in a way, you perform some kind of action that would suggest that you are acting as a shareholder of the property, which would imply that you are not acting as a cohesive unit, which implies that you have severed to a tenancy in common rather than a joint tenancy. There's also mutual agreement between the parties for one of them or for all of them to sever. And then you have mutual conduct, which is the sort of similar element of this, where rather than it coming into an agreement, it is just the conduct of everybody involved in the process leads to the conclusion that people have severed. And then you have the idea of unlawful killing, which is, of course, a method of severance that I'm going to spend very little time examining because it's very easy, and we'll touch on that right at the end of our lessons, talking about the methods of severance.